Good evening, everyone. This is an African diaspora gathering, and we believe in call and response. Let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. My name is Frank Garidi. I'm a professor here in the Departments of History and in African American and African Diaspora Studies. I'm also the Executive Director of the Eric Holder Initiative for Civil and Political Rights. Created in 2017, the Holder Initiative aims to inspire our undergraduate students to draw upon their liberal arts education, the superior liberal arts education here at Columbia, to do impactful political work during their time here and beyond. Through the creation of timely and innovative programming, the sponsorship of students' projects and internships, and the creation of a justice-oriented curriculum, the Holder Initiative aims to cultivate a broad conception of politics and of justice, one that seeks to empower students to address the many challenges of our time. Tonight, we're in for a treat. The traditional focus of the Holder Initiative, it tends to explore the question of civil and political rights and certainly race in a U.S. context. Tonight, we're going to branch out. We're going to kind of get beyond the United States, and we're going to shift our focus to an international context, and in particular to discuss the experiences of Francophone African peoples, African diaspora communities in France, Africa, the Caribbean, and maybe even elsewhere, which have always come going back to the era of slavery, and of course to the era of the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804. The question of racism, blackness, and whiteness, and coloniality has never just been a U.S. concern, right? Many people in the room know this, but I feel the need to say that in case you don't. Recall what transpired in Europe and in France in particular during the upheavals of 2020 after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, right? To see the uprising that happened in Europe, that happened in France, which in many ways resonated with long-standing concerns in the experiences of black people in France and in the Francophone world that we've seen in the colonial history of France, that we've seen in the history of the Pan-African movement, in particular the history of negritude, among other important movements in which Francophone African and Caribbean peoples have been central, way beyond our current moment. And from my perspective, really, I think in terms of scholarship and activism, the work of black folks in France and in the Francophone world are posing some interesting and important questions for us in the United States to consider. Right? Questioning all sorts of ways in which we think about Europe, the way we think about nationality, among other important subjects, which I'm sure we will discuss tonight. Before I introduce our amazing panelists, I want to thank Beth Manchester, there she is, who always puts together our events in a wonderful, seamless fashion, managing many of the logistics, as well as our student volunteers who are outside as well. I want to make a quick announcement. We have books available for sale. Unfortunately, our book vendor doesn't have a card reader, so I think they're doing cash only, unfortunately. So hopefully that won't stop people from purchasing the books that we have on hand tonight. Okay, let me get to it and introduce our amazing panelists. Of course, we'll start with Lilian Thuram. Born in Guadeloupe, Thuram had a prestigious international career in football for the French national team, a world champion of the World Cup in 1998, European champion in 2000, World Cup finalist in 2006, and of course he played on elite European clubs including Monaco, Juventus, and Barcelona. He's been an activist who has engaged in public debates on racism, immigration, and policing. In 2008, he created the Lilian Thuram Foundation to educate the public to do anti-racist work in Europe and beyond. He's the author of various nonfiction books, most recently, and this is pardon my French, Mes Étoiles Noires, My Black Stars, and of course, La Pensée Blanche, White Thinking, which we have on hand tonight. Please join me in welcoming to Columbia the legendary Lilian Thuram. Our next panelist is the amazing Maboula Soumahoro, who's an associate professor at the University of Tours and president of the Black History Month Association, which is dedicated to celebrating black history and cultures. She first taught at Bennington College for the MATSL program in 2003 and has taught at Barnard, the Bar Prison Initiative, and here at Columbia University, where she was invited as a visiting scholar in 2002-2003. And I just found out tonight that she's a Mellon professor here this year in the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department. A well-published specialist in the field of Africana studies, she's conducted research and taught in several universities and prisons in the United States and France, and was most recently the inaugural Villa Albertine resident in Atlanta. She's the author of Le Triangle et l'Exon, that's my terrible French, Réflexions sur une identité noire, published in 2021, translated in English by, of course, Dr. Kaiama L. who's with us tonight, who I'll introduce in a second, as Black is the Journey, Africana, the name, published in English by Polity Press 2021. The book received a special distinction from the Fetkan Marcy Condé Literary Prize in 2020. Based in France, Soumahoro served as an appointed member of the National Committee for the Memory and History of Slavery from 2013 to 2016. Please join me in welcoming Professor Soumahoro. We are blessed here in the Columbia Barnard community to have extraordinary scholars in the Black diasporic experience. And one of those extraordinary scholars is Dr. Kaiama Glover, who is Ann Whitney Olin Professor of French and Africana Studies and the Faculty Director of the Digital Humanities Center here at Barnard. She's written extensively about Caribbean literature in such works as A Regarded Self, Caribbean Womanhood and the Ethics of Disorderly Being, and Haiti Unbound, a spiritualist challenge to the post-colonial canon, and she's a prize-winning translator of several works of Haitian prose fiction and Francophone nonfiction, including Frank Etienne's Ready to Burst, Marie Chauvet's Dance on the Volcano, René Deprest's Adriana in All My Dreams, and of course, Maboula Soumahoro's Black is the Journey, Africana the Name, among other works. She's currently writing an intellectual biography entitled For the Love of Revolution, René Deprest and the Politics of Radical Life. Her scholarly and translation work has been supported by fellowships, many fellowships, including the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris, the New York Public Library's Coleman Center, among other distinguished foundations. She's a regular contributor to the New York Times Book Review and is a co-host of Writing Home, American Voices from the Caribbean. Join me in welcoming to this side of Broadway, Professor Glover. We have, I can't think of four better people to have this conversation tonight about Blackness in the Francophone world, including our translator, or at least that's his role this evening, Professor Laurent Dubois, who's John L. Knauth III Bicentennial Professor in History and Principles of Democracy and the Director for Academic Affairs of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. He's written seven books, at least, starting with many important works in the age of the Revolution in the Caribbean, including The Great Avengers of the New World, the story of the Haitian Revolution, and the prize-winning A Colony of Citizens, Revolution and Slave Emancipation in the French Caribbean, 1787 to 1804. His work on the cultural history of music, including the banjo, America's African Instrument, was published in 2016, which was supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Humanities Fellowship, and a Mellon New Directions Fellowship. And of course, his work on soccer and the politics of soccer includes The Great Soccer Empire, the World Cup, and the Future of France, published in 2016, and The Language of the Game, How to Understand Soccer, in 2018. Most recently, he's co-authored Freedom Roots, Histories from the Caribbean, published in 2019 with Richard Turrets, and his writings on music, history, and sports have appeared in many publications, including The Atlantic, The Nation, The New Republic, The New Yorker, The New York Times, among other places. Please join me in welcoming to Columbia Professor Laurent Dubois. I want to thank Laurent Dubois for actually suggesting this event. This is just a wonderful confluence of forces that brought us together here to have what promises to be an inspiring and amazing conversation. Of course, something important is happening in the world of football is transpiring in Qatar, and I suspect that will come up as a topic of conversation perhaps, not just the results on the pitch, but also all the forces that come together to create mega events like the World Cup, and obviously the question of race in the world of sport and soccer, super important as well, and I suspect we'll come to those themes at some time in the evening. I'm going to stop talking now, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Glover to begin our conversation. Thank you so much.
This is on, yes. Hi, thank you so much, Frank, for setting the tone. That was one of the most enthusiastic introductions I've ever heard, and I'm super into what we're doing tonight. Thank you for that a lot. I'm very honored to be up here with all of you. I will speak slowly, and I'll remind us all to do so that we can facilitate translation at the same time. So I should also note that at the end we will have opportunities opening up to you all. So if you have questions, think of them. I have a lot, but I will rein myself in. And when I say that we're open for questions, you're going to have to jump in quickly, or I'll keep going. So be prepared. So just to set the stage a bit, I think what we are trying to get to here with both of your works is the ways in which you can think about race in the French context. And I think where I wanted to begin was simply to ask you why these books now, and how these books relate to the works you've produced before, in your case, Lilian, and to projects that you're imagining coming up that I am aware of, but I'd love for you to share with others here. Maboula. Oh, come on now. 5 minutes.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Frank and Beth, for having us tonight. And I'm also so happy to be sharing this event with Laurent, Lilian, and Kaiama. To talk about our books, our works. Should I begin with yours, or should I begin with mine? Lilian. Okay. I have things to say about your work. Okay. Now, so to talk about my book, so Le Triangle et l'Hexagone, Black is the Journey, Africana is the name. Why the year 2020? Perhaps because of having spent over a decade in France, back in France, after having spent so much time, like a decade in the United States, having been trained and also educated, partly educated in the United States. When I finished my PhD, I was actually your colleague at Barnard College. And I think that this return to, could that be the native land, right? This place where I was born, that is to say Paris, France. I really caught up with the silence and the impossibilities surrounding, colonial history, slave history, racial matters in the context of hexagonal France, when for 10 years I had been delving into those issues in an academic setting and also outside of academia in the United States. So when I came back to France in 2009, I really found myself, back in some trap of silence that I had thought I had broken, free from with all that time I had spent in the US. So it actually took me 10 years of residing or being back in France to start thinking about the impossibilities, what couldn't be said, what had been said, of course, and written before, but at a particular time, the post-colonial moment. Not, Frank mentioned Negritude, for instance, or we could talk about, Césaire and Senghor and Damas and the Nardal sisters and all this intellectual history that I was familiar with. But in that post-colonial moment, a moment that I belonged to, being born of African, Ivorian parents who migrated to France in the 1960s, there was this sort of new identity emerging in hexagonal France that simply did not exist. There was this dichotomy between the foreigners and the nationals. There was also this dichotomy between the hexagon and what the French called the overseas departments and territories. But the people who are indigenously French, that is to say born on French territory, hexagonal territory, that simply did not, it was not discussed publicly, right? So this is what I can say.
Alors, tout d'abord, bonsoir. Pourquoi ce livre, La pensée blanche? Tout d'abord, c'est parce que il y a un musée en France qui m'avait demandé de travailler sur une exposition pour parler du racisme.
So why this book, White Thinking, is that a museum had asked me to work on an exhibit to talk about racism.
Et je leur disais, écoutez, très souvent, lorsqu'on parle du racisme, on parle des personnes qui subissent le racisme. Et donc, je leur disais que peut-être que dans cette exposition, il fallait un changement de point de vue et de questionner une catégorie qu'on ne questionne jamais, la catégorie blanche. Qu'est-ce que c'est être blanc?
So often in these kinds of exhibits, people talk about people who are the victims of racism, and I suggested to them they need to change that and ask about this category of white, or whiteness.
Et cette idée m'est venue parce que une fois j'étais dans un ministère en France et nous étions autour de la table et chacun de nous on devait se présenter à savoir qu'est-ce qu'on faisait et moi je disais voilà je travaille sur les hiérarchies dans la société. Ce qui est très intéressant c'est la composition du tour de table. Et le président de la séance dit ah oui effectivement il y a très peu de femmes. Et moi, je leur dis, mais non, c'est pas ça le problème, c'est qu'il y a trop d'hommes.
So once I was in a ministry at a meeting talking about an exhibit, and when I presented myself, I talked about my work, and then I said, what's interesting is the composition of this room, and the head of the meeting said, yes, it's true, there are very few women, sorry. And I said, no, the issue is that there's too many men.
Et donc, pour moi, le changement de point de vue, c'était quelque chose de très important. Et lorsque je faisais cette présentation dans ce musée, j'ai senti que les gens n'adhéraient pas au questionnement. Qu'est-ce que c'est être blanc? Comment on devient blanc?
So when I was talking to this group in the museum, I felt like we needed to change the conversation, but I realized there was a lot of resistance to this idea of asking, what is it to be white? What is whiteness?
Et j'ai eu le sentiment que tout d'un coup, il y a un nous qui s'est constitué, et ce nous disait, mais qu'est-ce qu'il veut, lui?
It was almost as if there was a we that was constituted, and they looked at me and asking, what does he want?
Parce que effectivement, j'étais le seul homme noir de la pièce.
I was the only black man in the room.
Et donc, effectivement, je me suis dit que ce serait intéressant. Bien évidemment, il n'y a pas eu d'exposition, hein. C'est-à-dire qu'ils n'ont pas suivi sur le projet.
So obviously they didn't follow my advice, and it wasn't an exhibit of the kind I suggested.
Et donc, effectivement, j'ai même pas démissionné. Je leur ai dit, écoutez, si vous voulez continuer à parler du racisme toujours de la même façon, moi, ça m'intéresse pas, donc je vais quitter mon poste. Et donc, voilà pourquoi j'ai fait ce livre.
So I told them, if you want to keep talking about racism the way you always do, I don't want to participate in this exhibit, and I'm not going to be part of this, and that's why I wrote this book.
Voilà.
Thank you. Okay. So I just want to pick up on something you both sort of alluded to, I think, which is this question of perspective, right? That the question changes, and the answers obviously are going to change depending on from what perspective you ask it or consider it. And that can be a geographical perspective, it can be a historical perspective, question of power, gender, etc. So I guess a question that I had in reading both of your work, not just why, but for whom. There's a pedagogical intention in both of your projects. You coming from the, shall I take a second? Yeah. You coming from the academy and then speaking into the wider world, and you, Lilian, coming from the celebrated world of sports and giving something of a history lesson and also a moral lesson. So I'm curious to have you both talk about for whom you wrote the work that you did.
Thank you, Kaiama, for this question, which remains a difficult question for me. I was asked the same thing by my publisher when they were trying to market the book. I had to explain who I was writing for. I think that beyond myself, because I was writing also for myself to begin with, I think that let's say my origins might be more complicated than this limitation to academia. Of course, when I started writing the book, it was back in 2019, I was entrenched in academia, but academia had become a new world for me. I grew up in a housing project. Everything academic was outside of my work. So there was the question of, the racial matters, but also social matters. Through education, social elevation did take place. So I think I always had the feeling of belonging to different places, different circles. That is to say, like the lower class and then rising, social classes. I was also, partly Ivorian, but born in France. I had also spent a lot of time in hexagonal France and then spent a lot of time in the US. So there was this idea of not totally belonging, but also belonging at the same time, but belonging to different areas, right? So when I think about the book, I think it was an attempt at writing from academia, but trying to reach outside of academia. I was trying to, for instance, not to write as I had written for my PhD dissertation or the academic articles that I had published. I wanted to use a language that was more accessible, particularly to the people that I still, I don't know, that I'm still in touch with, that I converse with. It's not, like the poor, the ghetto people. They're not objects of study. It may be my family, my friends, my loved one, everybody. So I was trying to, translate some of these academic findings in non-academic terms. So that might partly answer your question.
It very much does. Thank you. I'll have more though, so beware.
Alors pour qui j'écris? Je pense que j'écris pour le petit garçon que j'étais.
I write for the young boy that I once was.
Je suis né en Guadeloupe. J'arrive à Paris à l'âge de 9 ans. Et je dis très souvent que je deviens noir à l'âge de 9 ans.
So I was born in Guadeloupe and came to Paris when I was 9, and I often say that I became black at the age of 9.
Et je deviens noir dans cette classe de CM2 où il y a des enfants qui m'insultent de sale noir.
And I'm in my classroom in France, where people insult me as a dirty black person.
Et je reçois ça comme une violence, comme une morsure où je saigne à l'intérieur de moi-même et j'ai pas de réponse.
And I experienced this as a kind of violence, as a wound inside of me, and I had no response.
Et je rentre à la maison, je demande à ma maman, en fait, pourquoi ces enfants m'insultent de sale noir. Et ma mère me donne une très mauvaise réponse, pour moi. Et elle me dit, c'est comme ça, les gens sont racistes, ça va pas changer.
So I would go home and I'd ask my mom, why did they insult me like this? Why were they racist towards me? And she gave me a response, which I think is a bad response, which is said, that's the way it is, people are racist.
C'est une fatalité, c'est comme ça ne peut pas changer. Et depuis l'âge de 9 ans, j'ai essayé de comprendre le pourquoi du racisme.
So since I was 9, I've been really struggling to understand the reasons for racism.
Et j'ai fini par comprendre qu'effectivement, que chacun de nous ici, nous sommes le fruit du passé.
And I've come to understand that all of us are the results or the fruits of the past.
Et donc l'idée, c'est peut-être essayer d'emmener des informations qui vont permettre de questionner ce que nous sommes. Parce que très souvent, on ne nous éduque pas à savoir pourquoi nous pensons ce que nous pensons, pourquoi nous disons ce que nous disons.
So the goal is really to ask people to kind of question who they are, because a lot of times we don't ask why we say the things we do, why we are the way we are.
Et ce qui est très intéressant dans cette classe de CM2, c'est que ces enfants de 9 ans étaient déjà devenus blancs.
Mm-hmm. What's interesting is that in that classroom, those children had already become white.
Et qu'est-ce que c'est être blanc?
But what is it to be white?
Être blanc, c'est être conditionné depuis des siècles à se penser différent, supérieur aux non-blancs.
To be white is to have been conditioned for centuries to think of oneself as different and superior to those who are not white.
Et donc j'aurais aimé que les parents des enfants blancs puissent avoir le livre La pensée blanche et que ma mère aussi ait lu ce livre pour qu'elle puisse m'expliquer l'histoire de la racialisation du monde.
So I would kind of wish that back then the parents of those kids, of those white kids, would have had this book so they could understand and teach their children differently, and that my mother also could have read it so she would understand what I was going through.
Thank you. I'm going to push a little further. You both started off by expressing the extent to which this work was about the self, about yourself, grappling with something that you needed to express, caring for a person that you once were, caring for the person that you had been. I do want to ask, though, at the risk of pushing, having read both of your work, are there other people, this is a leading question, do you want white people to read your books in France? And at all, is that in your mind? And following up on that, what had been the reception of both of your works in the media? And I think, saying the media in the French context is really also saying white people in a certain kind of way, which we can get into, but yeah.
I don't think I had white people in mind. It wasn't the address But France is a white country, so I expected white people to read it. But I think that's what became playful, if I think of this potential white audience in France. What was playful for me was to use the format that I wanted, play with the academic codes, not include a bibliography, including as little footnotes as possible, and to play with a very, ingested knowledge of the Africana matters that I deal with, professionally. And I think that perhaps what I had in mind, maybe I was unaware of that, it was to put on display all the, the history, the cultures, the facts that this potential white audience did not know, without explaining myself, And I think that I did this deliberately. I'm going to talk about things that you might not know, but I'm not going to make a point of explaining myself, right? I'm not going to prove anything, because everything has been proven for 400 or 500 years, right? So this leads to the second part of your question. In the mainstream media, a lot of people reproached me that approach. Yeah, sorry. Saying that it was not academic enough, that I should have provided a bibliography, that I should have, listed the references. But I made that conscious decision to perhaps point to the fact that this you don't know. There's a wealth of knowledge of intellectual, cultural, and political productions that you have no idea of. And I'm not teaching you. I teach in class, right? That's my job. But I don't teach outside of the class, right? So so for certain people, certain journalists, it was difficult to understand and to grasp. It was like not deep enough. For colleagues within French academia, it was difficult to categorize the book. I teach in an English department. I'm trained as an Anglicist. I'm a specialist in US and African American studies. And then I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about Jamaica, and I'm talking about France. So what is going on? This is, where do you belong, once again? And for the other, audiences, that is to say everyday people, activists and artists, it was a really warm welcome, and unexpected book, and people were, and the younger generation of scholars too. They really welcomed it.
And that felt satisfying.
This is supposed to be a hard question.
No, because I don't know if I was looking for satisfaction.
Okay.
I don't know if I was looking for satisfaction. It was just, to me, perhaps one thing that I could add quickly is that it was difficult for me to write the book in French. I started working on the book in the US. I was on a visiting professorship with you. And I started writing what was to become the book in English. And I did a presentation. Professor Sada is in the room. Sharing my work in progress. But when I went back to France and that I was supposed to translate myself, it was really a difficult move, as if I didn't have a French voice to express what I wanted to express. So it really took my editor to say, why don't you try to explore in writing why it is easier for you to write in English and so difficult for you to write in French. So this is what I mean by, I don't know if I was looking for satisfaction. I was just, the feat was to write in French and in France. That was the feat.
Thank you. I'm glad I asked. Liliane, je répète la question ou on...
C'est moi, Lilian, c'est moi. Alors, personnellement, en fait, j'écris pas pour les personnes blanches. Comme j'ai dit tout à l'heure, j'écris avant tout pour l'enfant que j'ai été.
So personally, I don't really write for white people. I'm above all writing for that child that I was.
Et je me dis que si les enfants qui m'ont insulté de salle noire pouvaient lire le livre, c'est très bien.
I think it would be good if those children that insulted me could read the book.
Parce que je pense qu'il y a beaucoup de personnes qui peuvent subir le racisme, mais qui ne comprennent pas, en fait, l'histoire du racisme.
There are a lot of people who suffer from racism but don't understand the history of racism.
Et le racisme, en fait, touche quelque chose d'essentiel, l'estime de soi-même.
Because racism touches sort of one's self-regard, one's self-regard.
Et lorsque vous comprenez l'histoire du racisme, en fait, vous voyez que c'est pas vous le problème, ce sont les racistes.
But once you study the history of racism, you realize you're not the problem, the racists are the problem.
Et par exemple, lorsque j'étais joueur de foot, qu'il y avait des supporters qui faisaient le bruit du singe, ben en fait, je comprenais pourquoi ils faisaient le bruit du singe.
So when I was a soccer player and people made monkey noises at me when I was playing, I understood why they were doing that.
Et donc pour moi, j'écris pour qui a envie de comprendre.
I write for whoever might want to understand.
Et ce qui est très intéressant dans l'histoire du racisme, c'est que très souvent, les personnes qui vont dénoncer le racisme, on va essayer de leur faire croire que ce sont eux les racistes.
Very often in the history of racism, when people denounce racism, people tell them that they're the racists.
Et donc, je sais très bien qu'en écrivant ce livre, il y avait beaucoup de personnes qui n'allaient pas comprendre ce que je voulais dire.
I knew that when I was writing this book that a lot of people wouldn't understand what I was saying.
Et d'ailleurs, la première personne qui a voulu que je n'écrive pas le livre, ça a été ma maman.
And in fact, the first person who didn't want me to write the book was my mother.
Lorsque je lui ai dit le titre du livre, elle m'a dit non, 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 mon chéri, il ne faut pas écrire ce livre.
She said, no, no, my dear, don't write that book, when I told her the title.
Et j'ai même des amis, par exemple, aux Antilles, qui m'ont dit, écoute, quand le livre sort, tu prends l'avion et vite tu viens en Guadeloupe.
My friends back in the Caribbean told me, when the book comes out, you got to come right back to Guadeloupe.
Mais vous savez, derrière tout ça, ça montre à quel point certaines personnes ont intériorisé une certaine peur.
It shows how deeply people have kind of interiorized a certain fear.
Et comment aussi certaines personnes ont une mauvaise lecture du titre du livre.
And also how people misread the title of the book, White Thinking.
Parce que le titre du livre, ce n'est pas la pensée des Blancs.
Because the title of the book is not white people's thinking or how white people think.
Et peu importe votre couleur, ben, vous avez des grandes chances d'avoir une pensée blanche.
No matter what your color, you probably have a good chance of having white thinking.
Parce que pour beaucoup de personnes non blanches, la norme est blanche.
Because for so many non-white people, the norm is white.
Et parfois même, ils rêveraient d'être blancs.
And sometimes they dream of being white.
Et donc c'est pour cela que je pense qu'il faut connaître cette histoire pour changer notre façon de percevoir le monde.
So we need to know this history so we can change our way of perceiving the world.
Et juste pour le reste de la question, qui est, enfin, for the other part of the question, which was, well, was your mother right that you should have gotten out of France and run to Guadeloupe? How was the reception of the book by the media in France?
Mais en fait, vous savez, c'était très intéressant parce que tout au début, quand le livre est sorti, en fait, que ce soit à la radio ou à la télé, on parlait du titre du livre.
So it was interesting because when the book came out, whether it was on TV or radio, people just talked about the title of the book.
D'ailleurs, il y a certaines personnes qui ont même contacté des gens qui travaillent avec la fondation pour essayer de leur dire qu'il ne fallait plus travailler avec moi.
And there were even people who told other people who work with my foundation that they should stop working with me.
Parce que tout d'un coup, ce livre était un livre anti-blanc.
They said this was an anti-white book.
Après, lorsque on a commencé à parler avec des personnes sérieuses, parce qu'il y en a beaucoup, qui avaient lu le livre, eh ben, ils étaient interpellés, parce qu'ils ne s'étaient jamais posé la question dans ce sens-là.
Once we talked to sort of more serious people, and there were a lot of them who really had read the book, they were kind of interpolated by it because they'd never thought of it that way.
Et donc, après, la grande majorité ont compris ce que je voulais faire, et ils ont, la plupart des gens ont apprécié. Voilà.
And most of those, I think, understood what I was trying to do and appreciated it.
Voilà.
And in context specifically of the world of sports and soccer, was there any kind of consensus reaction or variety of reactions? You being a star and a national hero in that way, undeniably, did that do anything to, either did it do anything to your reputation and your prestige on that level, or did your celebrity help make the book more digestible, I suppose.
Est-ce que j'ai bien compris? J'ai l'impression, mais je suis pas sûr.
Oui, donc elle demande si le fait que tu es dans le sport,
Ouais.
ton statut dans le sport, est-ce que ça a eu un effet sur comment les gens ont lu le livre, soit pour aider, ou soit est-ce que ça a une influence particulière dans le monde du sport?
Ben, le fait que je sois joueur de foot, effectivement, il y a une autre lecture de ce que je fais.
Because I'm a soccer player, there's obviously another reading of what I do,
Mais c'est une lecture assez positive quand même.
but generally positive.
Et si je fais ce que je fais, c'est parce que je sais très bien que le sport me permet de toucher plus facilement les gens.
And if I do what I do, it's because I know that my status in sports allows me to touch people more easily than others might.
Mais depuis le dernier livre, donc La pensée blanche, je pense que je suis vu différemment.
But since I wrote this book, I think it has changed how people see me.
Et ce que ma mère pensait était faux. Je pense qu'aujourd'hui, les gens me trouvent beaucoup plus légitime à parler de ce sujet-là.
And what my mother said was turned out to be false, and now I think people see me as even more legitimate in talking about these topics.
Parce que très souvent, lorsque vous êtes joueur de foot, on vous perçoit comme joueur de foot, mais pas être en capacité d'écrire un livre comme j'ai pu écrire.
A lot of times people perceive you as an athlete, but not someone who's capable of writing the kind of book that I wrote.
Voilà.
Merci. Oui. So I think maybe, I don't know what this audience knows about race in the French context, and it might be an oversight to not have you to state what that is, and specifically, if I can use the terms that are most useful, I think, to understanding that, republicanism and colorblindness, right? So I think those terms need to be set so that I can ask you a question about those two things. So basically, if either of you would want to venture, just at the risk of being pedantic, to just kind of lay out the terrain. Yeah.
I think perhaps to say things very simply and generally, France, on a legal basis, is run by what is called the Fifth Republic, the Fifth Constitution. This is the constitution that was voted and adopted back in 1958, and which states in its first article that France is blind to race. And blind to, it's not gender, but it's sex differences, to religion. It's a secular country. And so what it produces is the non-recognition of racial or ethnic particularism at the legal level, meaning a racial category, unlike the United States of America, is not a legal category. So I think that the situation and the problem that it creates is that it is very difficult at the institutional level and even at the public level to discuss racial matters because races do not exist. Even though people can, commonly use the term ethnicity, for instance, they will talk about, ethnic groups, or they will talk about religion, particularly we see what's going on with Islam right now, but it's never about race. So whatever you experience in terms of, negative form of racialization has no meaning. You're not black. You're even less white. Yes, you're French or you're foreigner. That's the general ideology.
Thank you. Lilian?
Oui. Alors moi je pense que il y a une très grande hypocrisie dans notre pays, en France.
I think there's great hypocrisy in our country in France.
Je pense qu'ils ne font que parler que de ça.
And really, they're actually always talking about race. They talk almost only about race.
Par exemple, dans cette classe de CM2, ces enfants me renvoient à ma couleur, en me disant « sale noir ». Donc ça veut dire qu'à 9 ans, on en parle.
Since the 9-year-olds, they saw me and they used racial terms, obviously they were already talking about it and learning about it.
En France, on va parler des gens de la diversité. Et s'il y a des gens de la diversité, il y a des gens de l'autre côté quand même. Ceux qui ne sont pas de la diversité.
So people talk about people who are diverse, and obviously if there are people who are diverse, there are others who aren't.
Et d'ailleurs, il y a même un terme qui on dit de la minorité visible. Et donc ça veut dire qu'il y aurait une majorité invisible.
So they talk about a visible minority, which means there's an invisible majority.
Et en fait, très souvent dans les discours, il y a nous et eux.
Often in the discourse, there's us and them.
Et donc c'est pour cela que je dis qu'il y a une certaine hypocrisie. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, en France, on voudrait nous vendre l'idée que, en fait, nous sommes tous pareils, tous égaux, et en fait que la couleur de peau ne change en rien nos destinées de vie.
So people want to sell the idea that in France we're all equal, that we all have sort of the same access, and that skin color doesn't change anything about our destinies.
Et pour ne pas vouloir rendre visibles en fait ces différences liées à la couleur de peau, en fait on va interdire certains débats dans l'espace public.
So in order to avoid that things become visible, that these differences become visible, they essentially ban certain kinds of discussions in public discussions.
Donc je pense qu'effectivement, je pense qu'en France il y a une certaine hypocrisie à ne pas vouloir discuter de ces sujets, mais qu'en fait tout le monde sait.
It's like there's a certain hypocrisy. People don't want to discuss the topic, but everyone really knows.
So that was a setup for this question that I wanted to ask, which is about the U.S. and to the extent to which, looking across the Atlantic, potentially borrowing from exactly what you named, which is for all of the things that are deeply wrong with this country, the fact that we talk openly about race, racialization, and racism. There's a lexicon for it. There are terms to the debate that are out there. To what extent have you all found that useful? But also to what extent might it have been problematic or constraining to have to rely on, or to so often rely on, U.S. understandings of race and racism to have these conversations in a French context that ignores color?
I think the U.S. example is a very good example when it comes to how it is used and instrumentalized by the French that positions or that perceive the U.S. as the anti-model, right? The United States are the anti-model. We, the French, do not operate this way. We don't see colors. We don't make any differences. There are no racial, legal categories. And this is what we don't want to be, right? So I think that by doing that is, to begin with, it's really a misunderstanding of the United States, right? As a trained Americanist, I think it's really easy for the French, I perceive, to always talk about the U.S., to refer to the U.S., but without having a deep knowledge of U.S. history, right? Saying that the U.S. is a country of communities. There is no national cohesion. The country was based on communities. The colonies were colonies that were settled at different times in different locations for different reasons with different interests. So I don't see, there's nothing new or specific about that, right? And we, the French, are supposed to have a national cohesion, as if that national cohesion has something, natural, as if it has no history. It wasn't, built and, constructed, contested, and, that's really stupid. And I think that this approach of, the lexicon or, academic productions is also a misunderstanding of, U.S. academia. When I come to the U.S., I don't only, study with U.S. academics. People from Martinique are here. Edouard Lisson is in New York when I study in New York. Maryse Condé is at Columbia when I come to Columbia. There are so many people who come from the rest of the Americas, the African continent, the Asian continent. And so what does it mean to say you have been, brainwashed by U.S. thinking, right? So that I think this is something to take into account, along with the fact that, yes, there is some type of predominance of African American history as the, primary history of racial, negative racialization. But I think it's very convenient for the French to turn to African American history because it allows them to turn a blind eye to the French American history. And when I'm talking about the French American history, I'm talking about Haiti, that you know so well, and French Guiana, and Martinique, Guadeloupe, Saint Martin, and all the other, formerly colonial possessions, currently, possessions, but not colonial, something else, right? that are part, I mean, this is the American history of France, which is similar to, I don't know, US, Brazilian, Dutch, British, Spanish, Portuguese. I mean, French is not alone. France is not alone in that history. So I think that this, distancing with that colonial and slave past is only one way to silence and to not deal with that particular geography, that particular history that produced the racialized identities that we're dealing with to this day.
And so the same question for you, Lilian, but also to ask you specifically, and I meant to make you answer this before, but the relationship between this book and Les Étoiles Noires, which obviously delves deep into African American history and heroes in order to tell a story that would be useful in a French context.
Alors, tout d'abord, lorsqu'on dit qu'on ne parle pas de ces sujets en France, c'est faux. Ben, les personnes qui subissent le racisme en France ne parlent que de ça entre eux. Moi, depuis que je suis enfant, on parle entre copains du racisme qu'on subit en France.
So first of all, when people say that it's not talked about in France, the people who are subjected to racism, who are suffering from racism, talk about it all the time. Ever since I was a child, I talk with my friends about the racism that we're experiencing.
Par exemple, depuis que je suis enfant, ma mère m'a dit, si il y a un problème et la police vient, tu pars.
So for instance, my mom has told me ever since I was a kid, if there's a problem and police arrive, you get out of there.
Donc si elle me dit ça, ben, c'est qu'elle sait.
She tells me that because she knows.
Qu'elle sait que peut-être que ça va se retourner contre moi, même si j'ai rien fait.
That even if I didn't do anything, things will go against me or they'll go against me.
Donc la réalité, c'est que les personnes qui subissent le racisme, en fait, ils ont conscience de ça.
So people who suffer racism have consciousness of this.
Après, certaines personnes ne veulent pas en parler, bien évidemment. Et très souvent, ce sont les personnes qui tirent profit de ce système-là.
It's other people who don't want to talk about it. They're the people who profit from the system.
Et par exemple, lorsque on veut dénoncer le racisme en France, c'est vrai que le discours c'est ne ramenez pas le discours américain en France.
So it's true that when you try to denounce racism in France, people say, don't bring the American discourse or the American language into France.
Ben, à preuve du contraire, Aimé Césaire n'est pas américain. D'accord? C'est-à-dire qu'il en a parlé quand même. Frantz Fanon, qui devrait être connu par tous les Français, est presque inconnu, et donc lui aussi en a parlé.
Of course, Aimé Césaire, who's French, talked about it a lot. Frantz Fanon, who should be known by all French people, talked about it a lot and is not known.
Et donc la réalité, c'est qu'effectivement, au niveau politique en France, on ne veut pas en parler. Mais on ne veut pas en parler parce que je pense que la problématique du racisme, lorsqu'on en parle, c'est pour comprendre effectivement ce qui se passe aujourd'hui. Et si on s'intéresse à l'histoire du racisme, on va finir par comprendre qu'effectivement, le rapport de domination de la France avec d'autres pays, notamment en Afrique, continue. Parce que c'est ça le problème du racisme.
So part of the problem is that if you want, people think about racism as thinking about the contemporary context, but if you really look at it, you're going to realize that there's a relation of domination between France and African countries, for instance, and that's one of the roots of racism.
Parce que le racisme, ce n'est pas un affrontement entre individus.
Racism is not a confrontation between individuals.
Et très souvent, c'est un système économique qui explique qu'il y a des parties du monde qu'on peut en fait profiter d'eux.
It's an economic system that sort of allows for the exploitation of certain parts of the world.
Donc voilà pourquoi on n'en parle pas.
I see. So this is a kind of 5-minute warning. I'm going to actually sort of ask another question and then open it up for you all to ask questions, so start thinking of them now. But for my final question, because you and I talk so much all the time, including this afternoon about this event, I know you have questions for Lilian, and wondered if you, not to put you on the spot because I have other questions, but if you wanted to offer something or ask something. Donc, voilà.
Je peux te poser une question?
Demande en français, je traduis.
Ah non, elle peut poser en question, toi tu me traduis.
Comme tu veux.
Ou je peux te parler directement puisqu'on est face à face.
C'est un peu plus naturel.
D'accord.
Posez-moi la question.
Comment ça se fait que tu aies choisi cette voie-là? C'est-à-dire que tu aurais pu te contenter du confort, de la notoriété, du prestige, tout ce qui touche à ta carrière, au statut que tu as, auquel tu as accédé par le fait de tes compétences footballistiques. Comment ça se fait que tu ne t'es pas contenté de ça et comment ça se fait que tu as ouvert la voie, tu as décidé de parler, sachant que vous n'êtes pas si nombreux à faire ça dans le monde du football. Voilà, pourquoi toi tu as choisi cette voie-là? Et pourquoi tu n'as pas choisi le confort du silence?
So the question is, why did you choose this path, right? Why didn't you you could have easily been satisfied with your renown and your fame from the world of sports that you gained through your athletic achievements, but instead you chose this voice, and I wonder why you chose that rather than the comforts of silence.
J'ai pas choisi.
I didn't really choose.
Mais, parce qu'on me pose souvent cette question, mais c'est pas un choix. Pour moi, c'est une évidence que ça doit se passer comme ça, en fait.
For me, it's not a choice. It's something that really it should happen this way. That this is what we have to do.
Parce que, en fait, du traumatisme de l'âge de 9 ans, de la compréhension de ce qui se passe, quelque part, ouais, ça peut pas se passer autrement, en fait, de dire certaines choses. Parce que je pense que la grande majorité des gens ne comprennent pas grand-chose au racisme. Hein. C'est-à-dire, ils sont persuadés que c'est quelque chose de naturel. Et en fait, je pense que à partir du moment où j'ai été éduqué, notamment par des sportifs afro-américains, dont vous, quelque part, vous dites, mais c'est logique d'aller dans ce chemin et que vous n'avez pas d'autre choix, en fait.
Alors pourquoi tu es si seul?
Parce que justement, je pense que peut-être que certains ne sont pas éduqués à comprendre ce qui se passe et que, en fait, que les gens ne soient pas d'accord avec vous, c'est tout à fait normal. Ça fait partie du jeu. Et vous savez, ce sont les minorités de personnes qui changent la société. C'est pas la majorité.
So going back a little bit, he was sort of saying that from the traumatism of a young age, he had to do this. He essentially had to do this. But also in a certain way, because of the example of other black athletes, including American black athletes, he also in some ways thought that was the career, that was the direction he had to go. He thinks a lot of people really don't understand racism. And when you asked, why do so few athletes take this voice? And he's essentially explaining, he thinks that for many people, they're just not willing to or not wanting to understand it.
Et moi, je reste persuadé que ce qui met en mouvement les gens, souvent, c'est la compréhension de ce qui se passe. Et quand vous comprenez ce qui se passe, et ce qui va se passer d'ailleurs, parce que très souvent, c'est la même chose, c'est-à-dire que hier, Nelson Mandela disait certaines choses, en fait, il dénonçait le suprémacisme blanc, il a fini en prison. Hein. Et donc aujourd'hui, c'est exactement la même chose. Les personnes qui dénoncent le suprémacisme blanc, en fait, ils se font violenter, que ce soit symboliquement ou physiquement. Mais de toute façon, quand vous connaissez l'histoire, vous savez ce qui va se passer. Et donc, quand les gens me disent, par exemple, que je suis un raciste anti-blanc, en fait, je comprends que c'est logique. C'est une façon de me faire taire.
So he was saying earlier, right, that he thinks a lot of times a small number of people are the ones who really make change, but also that things happen the same way over and over again, right? So when Nelson Mandela condemned white supremacy, he was put in prison, and he's not surprised. He knows that if you attack white supremacy, you'll receive violence, either physical or in words or in other ways.
Et donc quand on essaie de me dire, écoute, reste à ta place, que ce soit mes coéquipiers, que ce soit mes dirigeants, en fait, je comprends le jeu.
So when my teammates or coaches or others say, stay in your place, don't do this, I understand the game that they're playing.
Et moi, je pense que la compréhension de l'histoire du racisme permet vraiment de vous libérer totalement.
I think understanding racism permits you to really truly liberate yourself.
Et je pense que si le racisme perdure aussi, c'est parce qu'en fait, il y a trop de personnes qui ne connaissent pas l'histoire et qui restent dans une certaine crainte. de ce qui pourrait se passer.
If racism continues, it's because so many people don't understand the history of racism and remain afraid of what might change, actually, if they did.
Voilà. Donc j'ai pas eu le choix.
I didn't have a choice.
The moment has arrived. We've got a passed mic. Beth, are you? Yeah? Okay. So just keep your hands up and we'll come around to you.
Are we the ones who are choosing? Okay.
Pass. Yes, good luck.
Hi, I have two questions for both of you. One of the questions for Professor was because you talk a lot about the emergence of new identity being French based on your experiences. And a lot of right-wings party, the rising of right-wings party in France, including Le Pen, there has been this kind of consensus that every time when there's emergence of organic identity, there's always pushback from majority, right? This is what's happening in France. As a scholar and academic, how do you see that is unfolding in the future? And for Lilian, you talk a lot about your experiences and the book that you're writing. You would like to have that to play a role in this emerging conversations about identity of being French. What role would you like your books to play in this contentious identity politics of France?
Can I ask, Frank, do you think it might be a good idea to collect maybe 3 questions at a time? Just because we've got about 10 hands up right now, if we stop each time. So, do you remember the first question? Right, so, yeah, I'll try to take notes. Did you remember that first question? What part of it was for you? An essay. Okay, so Laurent.
Given that we're doing with translation, try to keep the questions.
Yes, so brief questions and concise, please. So Laurent, we're going to take 3 at a time.
Okay, I have a question for both. Thank you, Maboula. Thank you, Lilian. Maboula, I'm a native Italian speaker, and when I speak about color blindness or like whiteness, some word that you mentioned today, I always struggle like to translate those terms like in Italian. So how is it for you like in French, beyond the fact that people don't easily understand those two concepts? And the other question is for Lilian. You mentioned the episode of you as a 9 years old being victim of like racism. When you were a grown-up boy, like playing, for example, like in Italy, do you think you were like better, like equipped to like react to episodes of like racism, not just from the fans, but also from the opponents or team members as well? Thank you for the opportunity.
One more, they'll answer, and then we'll do another round.
Thank you very much, both of you, for coming to speak to us today. So I have one question directed to you two, and then one question directed to Lilian. So my first one is actually quite similar to your first question, which is about semantics, right? So can you go a bit more in depth? Because you said something that's super interesting in terms of you struggled writing your book in French. And I wonder, is it because there's a lack of words, right? So could you speak about this difference in terms of the language and the power of words in their ability to create and to conceptualize social experiences, right? So can we speak of what we're experiencing in France? And then my second question to you, Lilian, is, as a former soccer player, there's this sort of huge debate in the French national soccer team, and I know nothing about soccer, but what I do know is there's this constant pressure on French players about having to be explicit about who they are in terms of like, are you French or are you African, you know, because there's like this racial fabric of the national soccer team. And so I want to know, first of all, did you feel that pressure when you were a player, an active player? Did they require of you that you explicitly say, oh no, I'm French, playing for the French national soccer team? And just generally, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, I just saw recently, I think Mbappe said something like, I'm not from Cameroon, like this sort of like in-betweenness where, as if you couldn't be both at the same time. So yeah, that's...
Okay. Yes. So regarding the first question that had to do, I believe, with the evolution, what's going on in France right now, I think that this evolution in terms of the imagination of the nation and the national identity in the context of the post-colony, right? I think that you're right to mention the rising tensions, that need to be understood as being, taking place in the context of the demographic evolution. So I think that the tensions that you're referring to are real and are, of course, dangerous and unwelcome. But I think that they only match the reality of, France's transforming identity. So I think that people are, let's say, mad. People are worrying. People are, practicing even more exclusion or, more racist because they have to face the people who are indigenous. We're not talking about immigrants, right? We're not talking about foreigners. We're talking about French-born people. So I think the issue is, that of facing a certain reality or facing or staying true, being true to the upheld ideals. If the national motto is liberty, fraternity, equality, what does it mean in concrete terms with this demographic evolution without leaving France capable of hiding behind some, some form of un-Frenchness? It's no un-French. Unfrench. It has become French. So this is how I view the evolution, and I think that the rising tensions are only proof of the anchorage, right? Talking about, I think I'm going to group the two questions because they're really talking about the same thing, that is to say language, semantics. So I think that France or, Italy, it's the same thing, like the Mediterranean area, even though it has been in touch with the African continent for centuries before, but everybody seems to have forgotten that. I think that today, yes, the issue of language is truly at stake, as it's also a reflection of the impossibilities, the conceptual impossibilities, and those conceptual impossibilities get translated in the lack of words. Even though if we look at French history, I'm going to focus on French history. If you look at the body of laws that was managing the treatment of slaves when slavery was legal, it was called the Black Code. It was black. There was no problem for France to say something about race. If you're thinking about the police unit that was instituted to manage the black populations that were coming from the overseas territories to hexagonal France, it was called La Police des Noirs, the police of the blacks, right? If you're talking about the colonial times and talking about, le Code de l'Indigénat, that is to say the legal system that was enforced on colonial subjects, right? Or if you even think of the category Muslim in North Africa, right? So there have been many instances in French history and therefore in French language where those differences, those tools, those of racialization have been uttered. Now there seems to be some type of amnesia. So I think that what is at stake is really the indigenization of those terms, and perhaps daring in a bold move to say those words. And that causes, and that raises questions, right? Right now I'm really interested in the matter of translation, and that was not something that I was interested at first, at the beginning of my career. But, to use the term black, journalist Rokhaya Diallo is here, so she knows. In France, you can say black in English to designate a black person. So you keep the English term to designate a black person, as if blackness did not exist in French, right? And I think it produces the effect of keeping black people outside. But beyond that, it's not only keeping black people outside, because I would argue, I don't have the scientific evidence, but I would argue that when people say black in English in France, they're talking about the indigenous blacks. Otherwise, they will say Africans, or they can say people from the Caribbean. When they say black, they're talking about the people who happen to be French, who are oftentimes French-born, but who simply do not exist in the national psyche, right? It's a way to keep people at a distance. It's for racial matters, but it also happens with, sexual minorities. People say gay in French to designate homosexuals, right? So there's something about some type of difference that simply cannot be voiced. And I think that one of the big, endeavor of these times is really to, to seize the language, to appropriate the language, and to find those ways to designate, to define and to, refer to those specific experiences. So I think it's a very, the stakes are high, but we have to find the language because the experiences exist. So we're working on it. We're working on it.
Écoutez-moi, je ne savais pas. J'aimerais qu'en France, on puisse comprendre que notre culture s'est construite sur un système raciste.
I would like that in France we understand that our culture was built on a racist system.
Parce que très souvent, quand on parle, encore une fois, du racisme, on a l'impression que c'est quelque chose qui n'a jamais existé en France.
Sometimes people give the impression that that racism never existed in France.
Et dans le livre, j'essaie d'expliquer qu'il y a eu pendant plus de 250 ans des lois racistes en France.
And I explained that for 250 years there have been racist laws in France.
Tout à l'heure, tu parlais du Code noir. Là, qui suis antillais, donc je sais exactement ce que c'est. Et ça se termine avec le Code de l'indigénat. C'est-à-dire que les lois racistes en France se terminent dans les années 1960.
So racist laws in France continued all the way until 1960s.
Et donc j'aimerais qu'on puisse aussi se questionner sur les identités de couleur de peau que nous utilisons.
So I want us to question the identities of skin color that we use.
Le fait de dire que quelqu'un est blanc ou noir, il n'y a rien d'anodin.
There's nothing anodyne about saying somebody is white or black.
Ça vient du fait de la racialisation du monde.
It comes out of the racialization of the world.
Et c'est pas quelque chose de naturel.
And it's not natural.
Dans le livre, je raconte une petite histoire avec mon deuxième fils, qui est Fred, qui était d'ailleurs en Italie. Et je lui dis, mon chéri, dis-moi, tu es le seul petit garçon noir de ta classe. Et lui me dit, papa, je suis pas noir. Et là, c'est un peu en panique.
So he tells a story in the book about his second son, Kefren, who was in Italy, and he lived in Italy. And Lilian said to his son, "You're the only black child in this class." And Kefren said, "I'm not black."
Et donc je disais, il a un problème, qu'est-ce qu'il fait? Il assume pas sa couleur.
Yeah, I said, "What's his problem? He's not following his color."
Et il me dit, papa, je suis marron.
I'm actually maroon.
Et je lui dis, mais les autres de ta classe, ils sont de quelle couleur? Et ben, il me dit, ils sont roses.
He said, "What about the other kids in your class?" He said, "They're all pink."
Et donc, vraiment, je voudrais qu'on puisse questionner ces catégories. Pourquoi questionner ces catégories? Pour comprendre qu'effectivement, le racisme, c'est avant tout, en fait, une construction idéologique pour légitimer des violences économiques.
Basically, above all, it's to explain that racism is an ideological construction that justifies economic violence.
Et que ce soit la violence de l'esclavage et de la colonisation, c'est basé sur l'idée qu'il y a une race supérieure qui est la race blanche.
So the violence of slavery and colonization is based on the idea that there's a superior race, which is the white race.
Et l'idée pour moi aujourd'hui, c'est se questionner à savoir quel est le discours que l'idéologie économique met en place pour continuer à diviser les gens.
So what I want to ask is, what is the discourse that economic ideology puts in place to divide people?
Parce que pour moi, c'est ça le plus important, c'est comment reconstruire l'idée qu'il faut reconstruire des politiques de solidarité.
Because the most important thing for me is that we have to build up politics of solidarity.
Et encore une fois, si on veut être solidaires les uns des autres, il faut dépasser les catégories où l'histoire nous a enfermés.
So if we want to have solidarity with one another, we have to surpass the categories in which we've been imprisoned.
Et donc voilà ce que j'aimerais qu'on puisse réfléchir en France autour de ce livre.
So that's what I hope to sort of contribute in France around this book.
Tu sei italiano? E allora perché non parli italiano? Allora facciamo fra di noi. Alors, bon, effectivement, moi je pense que lorsque j'avais ces problèmes de racisme en Italie, j'avais été éduqué à comprendre ce qui se passait et j'étais beaucoup plus fort.
When I confronted racism in France, I had already been educated to understand what was going on, and I was much stronger as a result.
Et c'est pour cela que je dis vraiment que toutes les personnes qui potentiellement pourraient subir le racisme doivent connaître l'histoire du racisme.
And that's why I say that all people who might be subjected to racism have to understand the history of racism.
Et quand vous connaissez l'histoire du racisme, vous n'avez pas de doute d'être dans la vérité. Il n'y a pas de doute. Vous êtes beaucoup plus fort.
When you know the history of racism, you have no doubt that you understand the truth and you're much stronger.
Par exemple, quand les supporters m'insultaient par le bruit du singe.
So when I was insulted with monkey noises when I was playing,
Donc ça vient de la hiérarchie entre les couleurs de peau.
comes from a racial hierarchy between skin color.
Mais en fait, il faut savoir que ces personnes, ils adorent le foot.
But those people love football.
Ils savent très bien que les joueurs de foot, quand même, sont des privilégiés financièrement.
They know that soccer players generally are quite privileged financially.
Ils voudraient être à ma place.
They want to be in my world. They want to be where I am.
Et en m'insultant, ils voudraient me rabaisser.
And in insulting me, they want to kind of bring me down a peg.
Mais ça marche pas.
But it doesn't work
Parce que je sais
because I know
que la figure de l'homme noir,
I know that the figure of the black man
de femme noire aussi d'ailleurs,
and black woman
permet à certaines personnes de se sentir bien.
allows some people to feel better about themselves.
Parce que quand vous méprisez un noir en disant qu'il n'est rien, vous êtes en train de dire que vous êtes tout.
When you disdain a black person saying they're nothing, you're saying to yourself that you're everything.
Alors que je sais que c'est moi qui ai tout.
But actually, I know I am everything.
Donc non, c'est important de comprendre l'histoire, parce que si on comprend l'histoire, vraiment, on est beaucoup plus adapté à voir la vérité. Voilà.
Sur la question un peu
Hai capito? Grande.
sur la question de l'équipe nationale et enfin les identités des joueurs aujourd'hui.
Sur l'équipe nationale, c'est un petit peu la même chose d'ailleurs. C'est-à-dire que on voudrait vous faire croire que vous n'êtes pas légitime.
So with the national team, it's the same thing. People want to make you think like you're not legitimate, that you shouldn't be on the team.
Et on vous demande des preuves de votre légitimité.
And you're asked to prove that you're legitimate.
Et on vous dit que pour être légitime, il faut que vous clamiez haut et fort que vous adorez la France.
And to sort of be legitimate, they demand of you to sort of proclaim loudly that you love France
Et vous n'êtes que français.
and that you're only French.
Mais là aussi, si vous vous intéressez un peu à l'histoire, vous voyez que ça ne marche pas.
But if you know anything about history, you realize that doesn't work.
Parce que lorsque vous êtes enfant et que vous êtes de la Guadeloupe, qu'on vous éduque en tant que Français, et que vous arrivez à Paris, et qu'on vous dit que vous êtes noir, et que la Guadeloupe, ça se trouve où? C'est où en Afrique? Donc vous voyez bien que quand vous êtes joueur de foot, on vous le demande. Par contre, on méprise les autres. Et les autres ne sont pas français, ils sont noirs.
So when you come from Guadeloupe and you come to France and people call you black and they ask, where in Africa is Guadeloupe? Then you learn that for soccer players they're asked about this, but other people they're just told who they are.
Et donc lorsque vous êtes joueur de foot, vous pouvez vous dire français et autre.
And so when you're a soccer player, you can say I'm French and something else.
Et certains voudraient vous réduire à une identité.
Some people want to reduce you to one identity.
Et donc vous devez être beaucoup plus intelligente, à savoir que votre identité est multiple.
And you just have to be smarter than them and know that your identity is multiple.
Et ce ne sont pas les politiques qui vont décider à savoir qui vous êtes.
And to not let the politicians or policies decide who you are.
Et là aussi, c'est une question d'éducation et de comprendre les choses. Voilà.
And that's just a question of education and understanding.
Voilà.
I'm getting signals to, or I'm trying to get signals. Whatever. Oh, okay. So it's bad. I'm afraid the signal was we need to
wrap.
Okay, one more. So I
We'll
will
let Professor Johnson answer.
Thanks so much. It's been great to have you. Thanks so much for being here. And you're the dream team of my family, so it's really great to have you between Lilian and Maboula. My question was kind of how do we move forward, you know? And where I'm coming from is I've been living here for, say, 15 years roughly, and the feeling I have is that there's a lot of issues here, there's a lot of issues in France in terms of racism. And, as you were mentioning, Lilian was mentioning before, you know, I think there's a lot of hypocrisy back in France, you know. Some of that is a bit naive, some of that is misunderstanding as well, and some of that is plainly mean, you know. And it seems to me that they expect that things will move forward naturally, you know, that eventually everything will resolve and everyone will be happy and everything will be colorblind. And in the US, there's been some progress recently, but at the same time, you could say there's a lot of backlash, right? It's happening at the same time as Trumpism, you know, a lot of like things we've seen, say, in Virginia back then. So it seems it's not working either, and we define, as Lilian was saying before, categories that are so strict, you know, that some of us, you know, for instance, our family, we wonder, like, where do we belong, you know? Well, you're not in one of those strict categories, so where are you, you know? So my question is really, so how do we move forward? So is there some thing like halfway through, or do we need to start from scratch? Just wondering where you're coming from and how we can improve things.
Are you asking for solutions?
Yeah.
We're going to settle this right here, right now. Now, I don't know. I don't have any solutions, but I don't think we can start from scratch because there's a history. There's a history on both, you know, shores of this Atlantic, whether we're talking about the U.S. or France. There's a history of, you know, struggles. There's, you know, the progress that has been made has happened not because of anything natural. It's because people have mobilized, people have been defiant, people have asked questions, people have imposed different conversations, not different, but difficult, conversation. It has not been easy. So every little progress that we have obtained rests or has rested on the basis of those confrontations. And I think that for today, the moment we find ourselves in, whether, you know, here or in France, it's really about, you know, breaking again the silence and the denial. I think that it is important, as Lilian said, to go over, you know, those racial categories and to develop a new imaginary and to hope for a world where the, you know, the public reading of anyone's body will not mean anything. But I think that to achieve that, I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, we have to deal with the very meaning of those bodies to this day. So I think that until we truly understand, it's not, no, again, it's different. It's not about not understanding what's going on, because people understand what's going on. It's really about being able to imagine a new way of interacting within societies. Because one of the things that we could say about racism is that it serves a purpose. It does structure societies. People benefit from racism, and people experience and are subjugated to racism. So I think that the matter of understanding is not the only matter. It's really about, you know, giving meaning and truly believing to, again, the ideals that are being upheld by both America, I mean the United States of America, it's only a country, not a continent, but the United States of America and France. At least if both countries could say, we don't care about liberty, equality, and brotherhood, and we're just acting the way we're acting because we like it, and this is the way we want to operate. At least people could fight, but we would know what we're fighting about. What strikes me is the, you know, all the contradictions and the paradoxes. On the one hand, you're talking about enlightenment, And as if enlightenment did not arise in the 18th century, that happened to be the most intensive, slave century, right? So all those contradictions. Either you own your values or you don't. If you want to own them, then we need to find other ways, but I think finding other ways needs to start from a reckoning and a recognition of truth and reality. How things operate. What does white mean? What does black mean? And what, all the things that fall in between. So I think that before we go to the, non-significance of those identities, I believe that we really need to get into the meaning of those identities and how they've been constructed so that we can move on. We will not be able to move on the basis of silence or on acting, by acting as if nothing had happened. There's a history, there's a present, so let's hope for a better future, but not on denial, not on denial. And no place is better than the other. I'm not saying France is better or the US. Both countries operate with their own means. And it's the local cuisine, but it's the same dish, right?
Tout d'abord, les choses changent positivement.
Things are changing positively.
Travailler sur l'histoire du racisme vous permet de comprendre la profondeur historique du racisme.
But working on the history of racism allows you to understand how deep historically racism is.
Et en même temps de sa proximité.
And of its proximity to.
Moi, j'essaie toujours de prendre l'exemple de ma propre famille.
I take the example of my own family.
Mon grand-père est né 60 ans après l'abolition de l'esclavage.
My grandfather was born 60 years after the abolition of slavery.
On a l'impression que c'est très 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 loin, mais en fait non. Ma mère est née en 1947, donc il y avait la ségrégation ici. Il y avait la France colonisait d'autres pays.
So we feel like the slavery is really far back, but then my mother was born in 1947 when there was still segregation and colonialism going on.
La fin de l'apartheid, c'est les années 90.
The end of apartheid is the 90s.
Et donc c'est tout à fait normal qu'il y ait encore des choses à faire.
So it's natural that there's so much still to do.
Moi je pense qu'il faut éduquer les enfants à comprendre que l'égalité ne se donne pas, elle se gagne.
I think we have to educate children to understand equality isn't given, it has to be won, has to be gained.
Mais il ne faut pas être d'une grande naïveté aussi, c'est-à-dire qu'il y a des gens qui ne veulent pas le changement.
But we shouldn't be naive, there are people who don't want change.
Et donc les personnes qui ne veulent pas de changement se radicalisent.
And people who don't want change are in the process of radicalizing.
Parce qu'ils perçoivent qu'il y a des personnes qui ne vont pas s'arrêter de parler.
Because they now understand there are people who won't stop talking.
Et encore une fois, lorsque vous avez le pouvoir des institutions, vous faites en sorte de garder l'avantage que vous avez.
And when you have the power of institutions, you do what you can to keep the advantages that you have.
Et le vrai problème, c'est ceux qui sont conscients qu'il y a un problème et qui ne font rien.
The real problem is people who know there's a problem but don't do anything.
Et c'est pour cela que je pense que la situation de notre pays en France est d'une grande hypocrisie.
That's why I think there's so much hypocrisy in France.
Parce que nous savons que le racisme existe. Mais il y a beaucoup de personnes qui le nient.
People know racism exists, but they deny it.
Et ceux qui nient le racisme, ce ne sont pas les classes ouvrières ou les plus pauvres.
It's not the working classes or the poorest who deny racism.
Donc nous n'avons pas d'autre choix de dire les choses et de prendre exemple sur les ancêtres qui sont battus pour qu'on puisse avoir la chance d'être ici, par exemple, à cette université. Non? Donc on va gagner, vous inquiétez pas, c'est sûr.
So we have to just think of the example of the ancestors who fought so that we could be here today in a place like this, and we're going to win, don't worry.
Il n'y a pas de problème.
There's no problem.
Beautiful last word, I think, no? We can end there and thank both Lilian and Maboula for being here and being so personal. Frank, you want to?